friends. This is Steve Dupuie for the Bible News Prophecy Program with Dr. Bob Thiel. Dr. Thiel, I read part of an article written by the Temple Institute of Jerusalem that mentioned the pilgrimage of a professing Christian from the Bordeaux region of France to Jerusalem in 333. What is that all about?
Well, I saw that same newsletter. I'm actually on the Temple Institute's mailing list. Basically, what they were saying was that a man from the Bordeaux region of France in the year 333 traveled down to Israel, Jerusalem. And although we don't really know what his name was, that's why he's called the Bordeaux Pilgrim. He went down to the Temple Mount area, looked all around, and he made a bunch of observations about various things that were there. And people have wondered if it was some type of a Jewish synagogue or something. Now, interestingly, there is a mosaic at a church in Rome, one called Santa Pudenziana, of a rectangular building, which is believed to have been the building that the Bordeaux Pilgrim actually saw. Later, a rounded building was built by the order of Emperor Constantine. Now, as far as this Bordeaux Pilgrim's building goes, the late 4th century historian Epiphanius recorded that a building had existed no later than 135 AD, and that it was built in the 1st century. And I'd like to read a little bit of an account from the late 20th century Roman Catholic priest and scholar Bellarmino Bagatti. And here's what he wrote. Precisely from the topographical aspects, the Bordeaux Pilgrim in 333 wrote, "Within the wall of Zion appears to be a place where David had his place." And let me comment, the Jews think this is where David was as well. As a matter of fact, David's grave is in that area as well. At least that's what they call it. And of the 7 synagogues that were there remains only one. Bagatti also said, as a positive fact we have that the Bordeaux Pilgrim saw on Zion only one synagogue. To explain the silence on the mother church, which certainly was on Zion, we can only identify this synagogue as mentioned by the Bordeaux Pilgrim with the church adapted by use by the Judeo-Christians, and therefore called, according to their usage, a synagogue. This is confirmed by Cyril, who half a score years later calls the place the Church of the Apostles. Now, I'd like to read something that Epiphanius wrote in the late 4th century. He said, Hadrian found the temple of God trodden down and the whole city devastated except for a few houses, and the church of God, which was small. It had been built, that is, in this portion of Zion, which escaped destruction, together with blocks of houses in the neighborhood of Zion, and the 7 synagogues, which alone remain standing in Zion, like solitary huts, and it remained until the times of Maximuma, the bishop, and Constantine, the king.
Dr. Thiel, if I understand you correctly, what you're saying is that a Roman Catholic priest is saying that the building referred to by the Bordeaux Pilgrim was not a Jewish synagogue at all, but rather a Christian church.
Yes, and that building seems to be the first Christian building. Again, it looks more rectangular, and it's also been called the cenacle. Now, in the 4th century, Emperor Constantine, who was a sun god worshiper, started to put up a rounded building next to it, known as the Hagia Zion. And I want to read something that Dr. Bagatti wrote about the 2 buildings. In 333, the Bordeaux Pilgrim found there a basilica erected by the order of Constantine. By then, the holy place had passed from the hands of the Judeo-Christians who had been there to those Gentile Christians. Now, this holy place seems to be the general location of the Church of God, Jerusalem, on Jerusalem's western hill. And again, we think this is the oldest Christian church building. There's some rumors that there might have been an earlier building in India. Maybe there was, but as far as in Jerusalem area, this seems to be the first one. Now, I've been there. I actually was there in October of 2013, and I took some pictures of some of the original building when I was there. And I'd like to read something else about it. It says, as far as some of those stones, it was first suggested by a Catholic scholar by the name of Pixner, a priest, that these stones are ashlars that were cut in the time of Herod the Great, and that they are consistent with those from the late 1st century BC, early 1st century AD. And these look like they were perhaps taken from another building, such as perhaps the original or the revised temple that was in Jerusalem. Now, that particular account mentioned the Roman Catholic priest and scholar by the name of Bargil Pixner, and I want to read a little bit that he wrote. It says, their adherence to Jewish customs in the Jewish holy days naturally alienated them from the Church of the Gentiles. So basically in the 4th century, Pixner saying in the 4th century, there were two churches. There's the original one, and those people kept the biblical holy days, and they were different from the rounded church that that Emperor Constantine had.
Dr. Thiel,
He also wrote,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
So, though recognizing the authenticity of the place, the Gentile Christians look with suspicion and almost on contempt on the synagogue of Judeo-Christians. And they consider their way of life outdated.
Okay. Excuse me again. Dr. Thiel, I've heard the phrase Judeo-Christian and Gentile Christians mentioned many times. What's the difference between a Judeo-Christian and a Gentile Christian?
Well, first of all, you can be a Judeo-Christian and be Gentile. The original church, the original Christian church, they were Judeo-Christians, whether they were physically Israelites or they were Gentiles. They were all Judeo-Christians, because the original Christians went to church on Saturday. They didn't have icons in their buildings. They kept the biblical holy days. They avoided unclean meat. And interestingly, with the rise of the Constantinian faith and those who went along with what Constantine was accepting, according to Bargil Pixner, in order to ward off the pagan and the Byzantine people, they actually put a wall around their building to keep it away from the round ones. They didn't want to be part of them. They wanted it to be separate, which is consistent with something that the Apostle Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians chapter 6. Says, don't be unequally yoked together with unbelievers, and to be separate. And the original Christians did that, because Jude 3 says to contend earnestly for the faith once for all delivered to the saints, and the original saints were Judeo-Christians. When we hear the term Gentile Christian, normally what we're referring to are people who decided to change. Again, people who thought the Judeo-Christian way was outmoded, and people who accepted decisions of various councils of men as opposed to Scripture. So that was basically the difference. We in the Continuing Church of God are considered to be Judeo-Christians, even though, for example, I'm not Jewish, and I don't think you are. I don't think you are either. Now, something else interesting about this particular building, though, I want to get back to this, is Bargil Pixner felt that, I'll actually read something that he wrote. He said the Judeo-Christians probably built their church at the time called a synagogue, somewhere in a decade after 73 AD. And for its construction, they could have used some of the ashlars, as these big rocks, from Herod's citadel, not very far away, or perhaps from stones used from the ruin of the temple itself, with the intention of transferring some of the elements of the Holy Temple to become the new Mount Zion. So that's what Bargil Pixner wrote. And not only did he do that, Pixner actually found something from a non-scriptural writing called the Odes of Solomon. It was composed around the year 100 AD. And the fourth ode says, no man can pervert your holy place, O God, nor can he change it and put it in another place, because he has no power over it. Your sanctuary you designed before you made special places. Now, what's that mean? Well, the priest Pixner said, was this passage a condemnation of the effort of the Judeo-Christians who built a synagogue in Mount Zion to transfer some of the holiness of the destroyed temple into their place of worship? And so, yes, I've been to this particular place. Matter of fact, the songbook of the Continuing Church of God, called the Bible Hymnal, actually has a photograph of some of these original rocks, or ashlars they're called. They're cut stones that probably were from the original, the temple of the time of Herod. And many people have said that, yeah, that's what seems to be there. And so I just found it quite interesting. Again, it was different from the Gentiles. It was not rounded. It was rectangular. And again, they kept early practices that we continue to do today, again, such as avoiding biblical unclean meat, having worship services on Saturdays, keeping the biblical holy days, seeking first the kingdom of God, etc.
That's really interesting. Are you saying that it is possible that the foundation of the first Christian church came from some of the rocks from the last Jewish temple?
Yes.
Amazing. Well, if what the Bordeaux Pilgrim saw was the first Christian church, and the gates of the grave will not prevail against the church of God, where are the remnants of that church today?
Well, they would be the ones who kept the original Christian practices often called Judeo-Christians. And I still think it's amazing that when there were the two churches, the two buildings there, the original one from somewhere around 73, 83 AD, that was built by the original Christians in Jerusalem, then a building near it, or very close to it, built by the order of Constantine, and they put up a wall between the two because the original Judeo-Christians, the original Christians back, who were people still keeping the same practices in the 4th century, didn't want to be part of the Constantinian religion. Now, some of these original practices, as I mentioned before, include the idea about keeping God's holy days. A lot of people don't realize, for example, it was because of Emperor Constantine that the idea of celebrating Jesus's birth on December 25th became popular. Basically, Emperor Constantine had worshipped the sun god, and the sun god Mithras supposedly came out of Iraq and was born on December 25th. And according to Roman Catholic scholars, that was pretty much where this date came from. But as far as other practices, Emperor Constantine leaned toward a different view of the Godhead than the original Christians did. And at a later council, not his Council of Nicaea in 325, but the Council of Constantinople in 381, the definition of the Godhead was changed, but the original Christians kept with the original beliefs. And so we, the Continuing Church of God, hold to those today. There were a lot of doctrines that were changed. For example, the idea of humans being immortal, having an immortal soul, that when they die, they go to heaven. That was not an original belief. Even the Greco-Roman Protestant Saint Justin Martyr said, by the way, anyone who says when you die, your soul goes to heaven, they're not a Christian. Yet those were adopted by the Gentile, what we'll call the Gentile Christians. Again, you can be a Gentile and be in the Continuing Church of God. As a matter of fact, most people in the Continuing Church of God are Gentiles. Okay, but in terms of the original practices, we hold to those that were originally there. And we have all kinds of literature on the beliefs of the original Catholic Church, for example. We have a free online book that you can find a link of it at our BibleNewsProphecy.net that goes into more depths about what the original church believed and what we, the Continuing Church of God, believe to this day.
Thank you, Dr. Thiel. For more interviews with Dr. Thiel, videos, and written articles, visit our website at BibleNewsProphecy.net. This is Steve Dupuie with the Bible News Prophecy Program.